Welcome back to the Daily Living Jewish Kitzur Shulchan Aruch class. Today we begin section 54 of the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch, and we talk about foods that count and foods that don't count. And if you have a chaser to your lachayim, is it worthy of a bracha? Or is a chaser to a lachayim not worthy of a bracha at all? Well, let's look at what our sages have the wisdom that they've shared, going back hundreds and thousands of years back to the Talmud. This is a big discussion in Tractate Brachos, and this is the bottom line. If you ate two different foods, or you drink two different types of drinks, one food is primary, while the other food is secondary. What do we mean by secondary? What we mean is that you would never have eaten the other food if you hadn't eaten the first food. Okay? So, or the same for food, or the same thing with drinks. So what's the obvious example? The chaser. The chaser means that you're only having the chaser because you just had the l'chaim. Without the l'chaim, you would have no chaser. Or, if you feel faint, and in order to fortify yourself, you eat some herring or radishes. But since they have a sharp flavor, right? So you're feeling faint and you're like, get me some schuk over there, something super sharp that's going to have me flying, but it's really sharp. And so in order to, manage the sharpness, you also eat a small piece of bread or something else to soften the sharp taste. Or, here we go. If you crave a drink of whiskey and you have one, and in order to soften the sharp taste, you eat a small piece of bread or some fruit afterwards. Then you say the bracha only over the primary food, but over the secondary food, no bracha should be said. Neither a preceding bracha nor a concluding bracha, because it is included, it is exempt within the bracha that you made over the primary food. So to answer your question, chasers are not worthy of a bracha. Why are they not worthy of a bracha? Not because they weren't created by Hashem, but because they are subordinate, they're secondary, they're included in the original drink. So when you make the bracha on the l'chaim, then that covers the chaser, because the chaser is it's as if it's non-existent. And he even says a piece of bread. So usually if you want to have even a little crumb of bread, you would need to wash your hands and say hamotzi. But if you're eating a piece of bread because you've just ate some hot chatzilev or schug or whatever it is, some hot peppers, and you're eating that bread in order to handle the sharpness of that pepper, then you would make no bracha on the bread. You wouldn't wash your hands, you wouldn't say hamotzi, you wouldn't say on the tedat yadayim. Why? Because it's as if it doesn't exist. It's included, it's secondary, it's subordinate to the primary food, which is which whatever it is that you were drinking or eating. So if it was a whiskey, then the bread is considered as if it's a part of the whiskey. Okay. Similarly, if you eat the secondary food before eating the primary food, for example, if you wish to drink wine or whiskey, and in order not to drink it on an empty stomach, you first eat a little snack. Sorry, I skipped something. I knew it didn't make sense. This rule would be excluded if you did go to another room before eating the secondary food, because then it would require its own bracha. So if right now I had a l'chaim, and then I ran to the kitchen to down it with a cup of Coke, then that cup of Coke would require a bracha, because once I've moved into another space, then the original bracha on the whiskey expires and it will no longer be able to extend itself to the cup of Coke. Similarly, you would make a bracha on the secondary food if you ate the secondary food before the primary food. For example, if you wanted to have a wine or a whiskey, and in order not to drink it on an empty stomach, you first eat a little snack. So although the only reason you're eating that snack is because you're about to have a l'chaim, you're about to have a whiskey, still you haven't yet made the bracha on the whiskey. Since you haven't yet made the bracha on the whiskey, so therefore the snack will require a bracha of its own. So if you wanted to first have a slice of bread before you drank your whiskey, then you would need to say hamotzi on the slice of bread, and you would need to wash your hands, because at this point you haven't yet drinking the whiskey. Only once you've drunk the whiskey do we say that the food is not worthy of a bracha of its own. However, since it is only secondary, some authorities maintain that the bracha was brought down to a lower level and you would only say shahakol. Others disagree. In order to remove any doubt, you should rather first have a little bit of your whiskey, say the bracha over the whiskey, and then have your piece of bread, and no bracha will be required on the bread. Since you're eating it immediately after having your whiskey, it's considered as if it is non-existent, it is secondary and subordinate to the whiskey and will be included in the bracha of the whiskey. But that's if you have no interest in eating the bread. If all you're interested in is a whiskey, and the only reason that you have that cup of Coke afterwards is in order to help you relieve yourself of the sharpness of the whiskey, then that cup of Coke would require, or that Coke and whiskey is the same bracha, but whatever it is that you were eating, that grape juice would not require a bracha of its own. But if you're interested in both, you're in the mood of having a whiskey, and you're in the mood of having a slice of bread or a can of Coke, then you would make a bracha on both. For example, you are going to drink whiskey and also eat some pastry, honey cake, some jam, or the like, then you would make a separate bracha over each. First, you'd make a bracha over the cake or the preserves because they're considered more important of a bracha. Because in a previous chapter, we learned the hierarchy of brachas when you're eating different foods, which brachas come before. And we said the brachas made on cake or cookie. If you're eating both a cake or cookie and a whiskey, first you'll make a bracha on the cake, and then you'll make a bracha on the whiskey, provided you want both. Especially if you eat some pastry and also drink coffee, you should say a separate bracha over each. That is to say, first over the pastry and then over the coffee, because you had in mind to eat both. So this that we said that a chaser is not deserving of a bracha of its own is if you're only drinking the chaser strictly as a chaser. But if you also enjoy the chaser, if you're having a cup of Coke as your chaser and you enjoy the cup of Coke, again, it's the same bracha. So it's not a good example. But if you are having a piece of bread as a chaser to your whiskey, and you're enjoying that piece of bread, then you would need to make a bracha on both, and you would start with making a bracha on the cake or the cookies or the bread, and then after that make a bracha on the whiskey. Although if you made a bracha on hamotzi bread, then you wouldn't need to make a bracha. Debatably, you wouldn't need to make a bracha on the whiskey, but we won't talk about that now because we just learned that in an earlier chapter. Okay, what about two different foods, one being more important than the other? If you eat two different kinds of food that were cooked together, but they're each recognizable in their own rights, then you would make a bracha over each kind, the bracha that is appropriate for it. Okay, others argue and say that once they were cooked together, you only make a bracha on the main food. So a practical example of this would be if you're making a chicken soup, and in your chicken soup, you've got both vegetables and you've got chicken, and they were cooked together. So some would say that you only make a bracha on the main food, which maybe for chicken soup would be the chicken. Others say, because they were cooked together, others say that no, if you could still see a piece of chicken and you could see a vegetable in that same soup, then you would make a separate bracha over each. But if the foods were mashed and clinged together, we apply the rule of follow the majority. So once it becomes one mass, then you'll only make one bracha. And then you'll follow whichever food is dominant in that dish. And that which is predominant is considered the primary food over which the bracha is said, and this exempts the secondary food. However, if one kind is of the 5 species of grain, even if it is the least in quantity, grain always takes priority, provided that it's there to give taste or to make the food more filling. So in summary, what we learned in halacha number 5 was that when different foods come together, when they're cooked together, at a certain point, once they become one mass, you will only make one bracha. So although included in that mass are different foods, you would only make a bracha on the primary food. An example of this could be if you're eating granola cereal, and in that granola is some raisins to give flavor to the granola. So the raisins could be considered just part of the larger dish of granola and would not require a bracha of their own. Seems like some would say that maybe they do require a bracha of their own, but the idea is that at a certain point, different foods, because in granola they weren't necessarily cooked together, so there's more room for argument. Although you could also say that the only reasons the raisins are there is for the granola, to give flavor to the granola. It gets quite complicated when we come to these laws of brachas, of ikr and tafel, of what's primary and what's secondary. Is it considered a single mass, or is it considered a concoction of a number of different foods? So at a certain point, when it becomes one solid mass, you certainly will only make one bracha. Before you've reached that point, sometimes there's a bit of a gray zone where the foods are each require their own bracha. In that cereal, for example, if you add some bananas to your cornflakes, you slice some banana and put it into your cornflakes that you're eating for breakfast. Should you make a bracha on the cornflakes and the banana or not? So I think maybe there most people would say, since they weren't cooked together and you want to eat both, maybe they each require a bracha. Others will argue that no, the bananas are only there to give flavor to the cereal, that it's considered one mass. The point that I'm making is that there is a degree of a bit of a gray area where I guess you could ask your local rabbi at what point the food is considered a single mass requiring only one bracha, and at what point you make a bracha on each of the different foods. And practically speaking, if you're not sure and you don't have the chance to ask, then you could always eat another food that has the same bracha that's not part of the mass. So for example, if you're eating a chicken soup and you're not sure, should you make a bracha both on the vegetables and the chicken in that chicken soup, what you could do is you could end up having a fresh vegetable that's not part of the soup, which clearly requires its own bracha, and enjoy that. Because if you're not going to enjoy it, then it's a question whether it requires a bracha altogether. And then have something that has the same bracha as the chicken, that's not part of the chicken soup, and enjoy that. And then you've got everything in your chicken soup covered. Or you call up a rabbi and hopefully he'll tell you what to make the bracha on. I'm sorry, I'm not giving that clarity. I feel that I know the halachas well enough to be able to give it finally. But the principle is that at a certain point, different foods become one. They're considered one entity, and you would only make a bracha on one of the ingredients, even though you enjoy them both. When it came to the first few halachas, when we spoke about the whiskey and we said l'chaim, so there, if the chaser is only being eaten for the whiskey, even if you're eating them separately, you will not make a bracha on the chaser. If you're not interested in the chaser and you're only eating it for the whiskey, even though first you had the whiskey and then you had the chaser would not require a bracha of its own. It's included in the whiskey. But if you enjoy both, you're enjoying both the cornflakes and the banana. You're enjoying both the granola and the raisins. You're enjoying both the chicken and the vegetables of that chicken soup, and they're somewhat in one mass. So then the question is, do you look at it as one unit and then you'd only make one bracha? Or do you look at it as still different foods when you could make a bracha on each? And as I said, there's a little bit of, there's a difference of opinions when it comes to that. I'm not giving you a final verdict. If you add milk or soup to a dish with the intention of eating the two together, if your main intention is to eat the food, then you say the bracha over that only. So classically, if you're having a bowl of cereal, some cornflakes, Rice Krispies, whatever it is, and you add milk to your OTs, then you would not make a bracha on the milk, because the milk is considered secondary to the OTs or to the cornflakes. But if your intent is primarily the soup or the milk, then you would recite the bracha over them. Then the food is secondary. So if you're mostly having milk and in your milk you're adding a little bit of some other stuff to, you're adding a little bit of oats to thicken it up, then you would make a bracha on the milk. Although oats is zaydas, that could be a little more complicated, but let's try to keep things simple. The general idea is that if you're only eating one food to help you with the other food, but you would not eat the second food in its own right, it doesn't require a bracha. But if you care equally for both, and each requires a different bracha. So you first say the bracha over the food, eat some of it, and then say the bracha over the soup or milk. So if you're having a bowl of soup, cereal and milk, some cornflakes and milk, and you actually have a point of having a cup of milk a day and cereal, so then you can't say that the milk is only there to help you eat the cornflakes, because you actually want to eat the milk as well. So then you would both would require a bracha. In this case, the majority rule, which dictates that that you say the bracha over the food, which is in the greatest quantity, does not apply. Maybe because they weren't cooked together, or you want them both. I think it's because they weren't cooked together. Even if the food consists of grain products, it's not considered important in this regard if you want the other thing too. Meaning if you're adding milk to your OTs and you want the milk, you don't just want the Cheerios, then the milk may require a bracha of its own. Okay, I see we have hit 5:20. I'm going to, please God, we'll conclude this halacha tomorrow and move on to the laws of which brachas come first. Who gets priority over here? Thank you so much for joining. Wishing you a wonderful evening, a wonderful week. You could stick around for questions. Otherwise,